Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's really a very nice privilege to have the opportunity to speak to the Rotary Club, speak about my work, but especially speak about the Louisiana Survey. I'll just say up front, I mean, obviously I have a bias. I am a huge fan of this project, the Louisiana Survey. It is one of my favorite things I get to do. In fact, it's one of the reasons I came back to LSU to work here, to have the opportunity when I was hired in 2014 to come and take over the survey beginning in 2015. I mean, it's not the only reason I came back to LSU, but it's a big one. So there are others. So before I took the job here at LSU to direct the survey and be on the faculty, I was living with my family in Oxford, not that one, the one in Mississippi, and my wife and I, we had our two children were very young at the time, and our oldest, who was 4 at the time, was in the lab school, at the lab preschool at, as you know, in Oxford, Mississippi, the University of Mississippi, known as Ole Miss. So our daughter was in the lab school there in preschool, and there was a day where my wife and I were in the kitchen, and we hear from the next room our daughter start the chant, "Are you ready?" and then break out into that darn hotty-toddy cheer that they do at Ole Miss. And my wife turned to me and said, "We have to move." And within a year, we were back in Baton Rouge, back at LSU, where both my wife and I got our undergraduate degrees. And so as important it was for us to keep our children from the heresy of being Ole Miss fans, another really attractive part of coming to LSU was the opportunity to work on this survey. So what I want to do today is I want to talk to you a little bit, at first about the survey, what it is, how we do it, but mostly I want to demonstrate to you why I think it's a valuable thing that we do at LSU. And I want to demonstrate that by talking about 2 questions that I think are particularly important for a year, 2023, when we are having our state government elections. And so those 2 questions are going to be, so what overall is the mood out there in the state? What are people in Louisiana thinking about how things are going in this state? What are the challenges? What would they like to see different? What are they happy about? It's not much. So I want to unpack that a little bit. And then I want to turn to a second question that speaks to what do we think about each other, particularly politically. How divided are we? Are we as divided as we think we are? What does that look like? So those are the 2 questions I want to explore with the Louisiana Survey. But I want to start by just kind of telling you just a little bit about what it is, in case you haven't encountered it before. The Louisiana Survey has been around for 20 years. 2023 was our 20th anniversary. The survey began well before my time at LSU on the faculty. It began in 2003, and it's a project of the Riley Center for Media and Public Affairs at LSU's Manship School of Mass Communication. And the project was started 20 years ago as a way of really trying to get rich data on what's happening out there in the state, across the geographic and demographic diversity we have in this state. What's the pulse? What are people thinking? How are people feeling? What do people think's working? What are the challenges they see? How are their lives going? And what would they like to see the state do? In a sense, it was a project to give voice to the people of Louisiana, we're all part of that, but to get beyond the ivory tower that I live and work in, to get beyond what might be going on in legislative chambers, and to be fair, even to get beyond what might be discussed in the luncheon for the Rotary Club of Baton Rouge, to really see what the people as a whole and across its diversity of backgrounds think about the state and life in the state. And so that was the project. The survey goes in we've done it for 20 years, so we've got a lot of longitudinal data. We can look at things over time, how things have changed. But another thing that makes our survey different than a lot of other surveys is we're really trying to collect the rich detail across a bunch of different topics. So we don't do the kind of thing about, in an election year, who are you going to vote for, who's up in the polls, who's down in the polls. That's not us. Actually, polling has had a bad rap recently. Some of it deserved, some of it maybe not as much. Pollsters in Louisiana for decades, election pollsters in Louisiana actually do better on average than many other pollsters around the state, believe it or not. So we've got some great pollsters, but that's not what we do at the Riley Center. We're trying to get sort of a deeper dig to try to get a sense of what underlies the thinking of the public. And so our surveys are pretty long. We don't just hop in the field, ask you who you're going to vote for. We don't even ask about who people are going to vote for. We ask about, like I said, life experiences, attitudes, beliefs, what's going on, what they'd like to see different. And we spend each of these interviews 20 to 25 minutes. It's an extensive period of time of talking to these folks, usually 500 to 1,000 people a year. And for 20 years we've done that. So we've got an incredibly rich data set. And I want to use it now to talk to you about some things that I think matter. There's some technical details I could go into in Q&A about how exactly we do the survey, why it's great, but I'll save those for later. I want to jump into the material. So first, let's look at that first big question. How do folks across Louisiana feel about what's going on in the state? So to show you the value of the survey, I'm going to start off with just one number. Every year we ask folks, actually I should mention this first. So when we develop the survey, part of what makes it a rich data set is we ask, like I said, it's 20 minutes, a lot of questions. Our questions tend to fall in 3 buckets. The first bucket is we have some questions we ask every year, have since 2003. There's a second bucket of questions that are batteries we rotate in every 2 to 4 years or so. I'm going to show you some of those in a few moments. For example, every 4 years we ask folks to grade various aspects of quality of life in Louisiana. We also have a battery of questions on fiscal policy, taxes and spending that we do every 2 or 3 years. And then the third bucket of questions, we change from year to year, and we figure out what those are going to be by talking to folks involved in the policy community in this state that have their ear to the ground to get a sense of what are the important topics that particular year. And so those will change from year to year. So for example, in 2023, we had questions, a deep dive into experiences with insurance, both coverage and premiums and costs, particularly homeowners insurance, flood insurance, and also some auto insurance stuff. We also had a battery of questions related to abortion. Last year, we floated in questions about broadband access, transportation infrastructure, election rules. The year before that, in 2021, we had questions, unsurprisingly, COVID response, race relations. So there are different topics that will change from year to year based on what seems like it might be of concern in that particular year. But I want to start off by showing you a question we ask every year. And it's the question we start out with on the survey every year since 2003. In general, do you think the state's going in the right direction or the wrong direction? So I'm going to show you just a graphic that went up on social media about it, but it's just the one number I want you to see here, 61%. That's 61% of Louisiana adults in our sample that said the state's heading in the wrong direction. That's not good, right? We don't like that number, 61%. It's a clear majority of folks saying state's heading in the wrong direction. But if you think that number's not good, I've got even worse news for you. Not only is that number, 61%, seem high, it is high. And I can show you it's high by comparing it to 20 years of asking this question. And it's actually a little bit lower than it was just last year, but we are in like unprecedentedly pessimistic times in this state, or just about unprecedentedly. So let me show you 20 years of asking this question. I understand that's going to be a little hard to see, so I'm going to walk through it verbally. I'm going to put 2 lines up here. The first line, the purple line, is going to be the share of people across 20 years that said the state is heading in the right direction. So there you go. And now I'm going to show you the gold line, which is the opposite, the wrong direction. This is the one. So over here at the end, you've got the 61% that I just mentioned. Last year, it was about 65%. Only one other time in the history of this survey have we gotten anywhere into the 60s, and that was that one year right there. 2 consecutive years that are among the 3 highest levels of people saying the state's heading in the wrong direction. That's why I'm saying it's about unprecedented for our state. We haven't had these numbers this high and then consistently back-to-back years in the history of the survey ever. But the other thing I want to point out to you is if you look at the overall trend across 20 years, yes, it goes up and down. There's fluctuations. There's not like every year just follows the past year. But if you look, so let me come back just a moment, just at this one, the right direction. The general trajectory of that since about 2008, 2009 is a downward slope. Yeah, it bounces up and down, but the general trajectory on average has been a move of increasing pessimism over the course of 20 years. So not only are folks saying, hey, I don't feel great about where the state's going today, they're saying that more and more and more with time passing. We're becoming increasingly pessimistic about the direction of the state. And I can show you this in other ways too. Something else we ask every year is how confident people are in the state government to solve the problems, the important problems in the state. So what do we see? Let's look at that one, same time frame over about 20 years. And generally, this is the share of people saying that they're either very confident or somewhat confident in the state government to solve problems. And that number it peaked around, I lost my clicker here. Oh, I'm covering it up with my hands. It peaked around, what is that, 08, 09, and it's been a fairly negative trajectory since then. It leveled off for a little bit, but it's generally been on the decline for about almost 14, 15, 16 years. Again, it's less and less optimism, less confidence in the state government. So like none of that's good news. Let me show you one other thing about asking about another way we can use the survey is not just comparing things over time, but because we ask all these questions, we can try to unpack and explore what's on people's minds, what do they care about. So for example, every year we ask folks, what do you think is the most important problem? In your own words, you tell me, not just choose from a list, but you tell me what's on your mind, what are you worried about? But another thing we do every 4 years or so is we ask people to grade various aspects of quality of life in the state. So now we can go into specifics. What I've shown you so far is pretty general. Confidence in state government, direction of the state. Are people, if everybody's upset, or most people are upset, are they all upset about the same things? Are they upset about economic stuff? Are they upset about education? Are they upset about roads? Well, we can unpack that by looking at how people respond to specific aspects of quality of life. So we asked folks, this year we asked 8 things, and we, like I said, we do this about every 4 years, these particular questions, surveys every year. To grade from A, B, C, D, or F, how would you grade the quality of transportation infrastructure? We say like roads, bridges, and highways. We don't use words like infrastructure on a survey. How would you grade coastal protection? How would you grade the environment? How would you grade quality of healthcare? How would you grade, quality of public K-12 education? How would you grade higher education, colleges in the in the state? How would you grade overall quality of life in the state, Louisiana as a place to live? So I'm going to walk you through some of these. I'm going to show you the share of people that give A's or B's to these things. And so we can see which ones people are dissatisfied with and which ones, it won't be many, that they feel a little more positive about. So I've sorted them here. Basically, the ones that are lower down the list, I'll walk through those in words, are the ones that people are least satisfied with. So what about roads, bridges, highways, transportation stuff? Only 10% of people in the state give an A or a B. Now that might not be surprising. And in fact, we get this pretty consistently whenever we ask these questions. About 1 in 10 people are like, no, my roads are good. Everybody else is like, a lot of D's and F's, not a lot of A's and B's when it comes to grading the quality of transportation infrastructure in the state. Next lowest, public schools. So we're about 16% or so of Louisiana adults grading Louisiana's public K-12 schools with an A or B. This number's been coming down. In fact, many of these numbers have been coming down, except for transportation infrastructure, because that's always been low, right? I guess we hit the ground, right? We went through the pothole, can't get any lower. But public schools, that's come down. 10 years ago, that number was twice as high. So we've seen some growing pessimism in how people feel about public education in the state. But as we proceed through the next view, so even here, state economic development, it's still only a minority of folks, we're in the 20s now, are giving the state an A or a B. Louisiana an A or B in terms of its economic development. This is the one I want to stop on for a moment. This one is Louisiana as a place to live. So this isn't just specifically healthcare or education. This is Louisiana overall as a place to live. And the reason I want to pause on this one is because it's about 26% or so give it an A or a B. That number's low, historically for us, because it's been coming down every time we've asked this question over the last 14 No, since 2009, 2011, so over the last 12-ish years. We used to find that people would grade schools low, environment low, healthcare low, transportation low, but they'd say, no, but I love living in this state. It's like we were in this thing where people were like, poverty and potholes, yeah, but crawfish and meat pies, y'all. Those days are going. People are now more negative, not just about the potholes and the poverty, but about Louisiana as a place to live. In 2011, this was 63% of people gave the state A or B as a place to live. Even as they gave low grades to all these other specifics, they would still give high grades to Louisiana overall as a place to live. 4 years after that, 2015, it dropped to 41%. 4 years after that, in 2019, it was 35%. Now we're down to 26%. Like, that's in 12 years, we've cut more than half of the share of adults in the state that say, hey, I give this state, as an overall quality of life, an A or B. That's an astounding drop. And frankly, one I would find worrisome. Again, not a lot of A's and B's for things like healthcare, environment, coastal protection. So what does do a little bit better? Colleges and universities. So as a representative of colleges and universities in the state, I will say you're welcome. Or maybe I should be saying thank you. I will say it's too many B's, as I like to tell my students. Let's try to get some of those B's up into A's. So we got a lot of B's, but still a majority of people giving colleges and universities in the state A's or B's. And look, this survey was in the field in the spring, so this was not just an LSU sports thing. This was before my alma mater and employer won not one but 2 national championships so far in the year of our Lord 2023. One shining spot is a big majority of folks give A's and B's to their own local neighborhood as a place to live. So that's still holding on. People seem to like their own local neighborhood where they live, but they're not as keen on the state as a place to live overall as they used to be. And they're still negative and becoming more negative on things like the quality of health care they have access to, the quality of public schools, still super not happy about the quality of roads. So overall, where does that leave us on terms of what the mood of the state is? It's pretty sour. People aren't particularly enthusiastic in this state right now. But I want to follow that up with a second question. What about each other? What do we think about each other and the extent to which we've got common ground, we could potentially find compromise? Because look, if we're all upset, maybe we're all on the same page. Or is it that we're all upset and you guys over here are like, this is not working, let's do X, and you guys over here are like, yeah, you're right, this is not working, but we can't do X. That's going to make it worse. So how divided are we? Can we find common ground on things to help solve the problems people are worried about in this state? So what I want to do is I want to explore the idea of polarization for just a minute. And the way I want to do that is I want to look to see how ideologically divided the public in Louisiana is. And I'm going to do that by exploring 2 questions in the survey. One is we ask people, like, what do you think of yourselves as, Democrats, Republicans, or whatnot? This is not how they're registered, it's what they think of themselves as. And the vast majority of Louisianans do still think of themselves as at least closer to one of the 2 major parties. Even though like the share of people not registered with a particular party is rising, the share of people who still think of themselves in their heads as being like, I mean, I'm not registered with a party, but like I'm down with the Republicans, that's pretty high. So we're going to look at the Democrats and the Republicans out there in the public, and we're going to look at how they describe themselves ideologically. Are you very liberal, somewhat liberal, moderate, somewhat conservative, very conservative? And so I'm going to show you 2 graphs. One of which is going to be Democrats on the it's going to be on the left, Democrats on the left, Republicans on the right. There's rules to how we do this. And I'm going to show you how Democrats describe themselves ideologically and how Republicans describe themselves ideologically. And what we really want to look to is to see if all the Democrats are on the left and all the Republicans are on the right. So let's take a look at that. Okay, so what you're seeing here is the graph on the left is how Democrats describe themselves. Right? And so, for instance, 9% of Democrats describe themselves as very liberal. Meanwhile, what does that say? I think it says 39% of Republicans describe themselves as conservative. I want to draw your attention to the solid blue and the solid red. The solid blue are the percentages of Democrats who are on the left side of the political ideological spectrum. The solid red are the share of Republicans on the right side of the ideological spectrum. And the gray is everybody else, right? So people who think of themselves as moderate, or Democrats who think of themselves as conservative, or Republicans who think of themselves as liberal. Not many of those folks. So what do you see? On the Republican side, it's pretty clear. Almost 80% of Republicans describe themselves as either somewhat conservative, conservative, or very conservative. Huge majority of Republicans think of themselves as conservative. Of course they do. That's what we expect. That's what we hear about. Democrats, similar pattern, not as strong. So it's only about 51% of Democrats, a slim majority, but still just over half of Democrats think of themselves as on the left. Big majority of Republicans think themselves on the right. That's what we call polarization, right? We've got most Democrats, barely, but most, on the left, most Republicans on the right, which means fewer folks overlapping. And with fewer folks overlapping, we might be worried that it'll be harder to find common ground, harder to find trust, harder to listen to different sides of an issue. So that's some degree of polarization. I'll say this gap is increasing and has over the course of 20 years that this survey's been around. Most of the action has been among the Democrats. Republicans have been pretty fairly conservative on this survey for 20 years in terms of how they identify themselves. What we've seen is the share of Democrats who describe themselves as somewhat liberal, liberal, or very liberal has increased over time, so that the parties are further apart now than they were in 2003 when we talk about how they identify themselves ideologically. We know that pattern exists. We've heard about it nationally. Yes, it's happening here in Louisiana. Maybe not to quite as strong of a degree, but it's still happening here as well. Okay, so I want to take this up just a little bit more complicated. Politics is about perception. When it comes to my willingness to sit down with you and have a conversation about what you think about some issue, and my willingness to engage in a good faith effort to search for common ground and hear you out and potentially compromise to give a little to get a little, decades of research show the further apart we think we are, the less likely we're going to do that, right? I am less interested in even attempting to compromise with you or hear you out if I think you're way over there. So what matters more than how far apart we may be is how far apart we might think we are. So one of the things we did on this year's survey to explore this topic is we didn't just ask you, do you think of yourself as conservative, moderate, liberal? We also asked you, folks, do you think Democrats are conservative, moderate, or liberal? Do you think Republicans are conservative, moderate, or liberal? So I'm going to change this graph. I'm going to take this down, and oops, I gave it away. I'm going to replace each of these with these perceptions. So on the left side here, I'm going to take away this graph that shows how Democrats describe themselves, and instead I'm going to show you how Republicans describe Democrats. That's what the blue part is going to be, how Republicans describe Democrats. And then on the right side, I'm going to show you how Democrats, people who call themselves Democrats, describe Republicans ideologically. And when we do that, so the way to read this graph is 29% all the way on the left there. That means 29% of Republicans think Democrats are very liberal. Come all the way to the other side, 45% of Democrats think Republicans are very conservative. So in other words, the vast majority of Republicans, about 80%, say Democrats are liberal, at least somewhat liberal, if not more. And almost half of Democrats say Republicans are very conservative. What this means is, if you compare these two, like, we think of ourselves as super far apart. We might be somewhat far apart, but we think of ourselves as very far apart, and these perceptions matter. So far, what I've told you today is not particularly rosy. Folks are pretty sour on how things are going in the state, and they see each other as super divided. But you know what? I don't want to be the downer in the room. I like to think of the Rotary Club as an inherently optimistic organization. The reason is because you guys are engaged in all kinds of important work as a club, but also in your livelihoods and your voluntary activity. Everybody I know in the Rotary Club is super civically engaged. involved in causes, right? And inherently that speaks to me to an optimism, a belief that like, hey, one can go out and do good. So if you believe, right, that things can be good, that you can do good work, that to me is optimism. Well, I've just come in here and just like rained on all that. And I don't want to leave it that way. I don't want to be a downer. So I'm going to try to give 2 points of optimism to leave you with before I close this out. One is, just remember, this is the perception, but this is the reality. Yes, there's division in the reality, but things aren't as bad as we think they are in terms of divisions. We are not actually as far apart as we think we are. Democrats and Republicans, yes, they disagree, but they don't disagree as much as they think they do. So if you can move those perceptions, then you might get more overlapping common ground. And then the last point I want to make is even this one, this graph that compares how people actually identify themselves, not the perceptions, probably overstates how divided we are. We're probably not as divided as this either. And the reason I say that is, remember how I said what's great about the Louisiana Survey is we ask all these questions. We've got like 80 questions each year. Well, I looked at over about a 4-year period and pulled every question about a specific policy issue. It was about 48 questions. And I looked basically at graphs like this for each of those questions, with the idea being trying to find how often on a specific policy issue, teacher pay raises, the death penalty, abortion, raising the sales tax. When you look at a specific issue, how often do you find something like this, where a majority of Democrats are on one side and a majority of Republicans are on the other? 12. Out of 48, 12. Just 1 out of every 4 issues, just 25% of issues do we actually have division across parties on specific issues. Most of the time, there's much more overlap. There's much more Democrats and Republicans sharing the same views on nuts and bolts policy issues in the weeds. Where you see the big differences are where you would guess. It tends to be social issues, tends to be culture war kind of stuff. That's where you see the biggest divisions. But on a lot of other stuff, the stuff that can still affect the lives of all those people that are upset about schools and roads and quality of healthcare access in this state, a lot of those issues, you don't see these kinds of divisions. You see much more common ground, which means much more room to compromise and perhaps more room to find solutions for the kinds of things that have us feeling sour on the direction of the state today. Thank you. So we have a little bit of time for questions. I've been asked to ask you to use the microphone. So let's start here, and then I think I have another one over here next.
I don't know where the microphone is, but I'll wait till it comes to me. Or I'll talk until Ray.
I'll repeat the question.
Okay, great. My question is, where in the beginning of the survey, where it talked about how we felt about Louisiana and it was going up or down, did any of that have any correlation with whether there was a particular political party in place at that time?
Yeah, that's a great question. The question is, as we see over time, direction of the state, it moves up or down. Does that have anything to do with the political party in power? The answer is, it seems like it used to, but not as much anymore. So if you go back to the early years of the survey, Blanco and the shift to Governor Blanco and then Governor Jindal, there seemed, and if you look at the data and dig into who says wrong direction, who says right direction, a lot of it seems to be politics. Republicans really liked the state a lot better when Bobby Jindal was elected, and Democrats liked it less, right? So you expect some of that. That starts to fade away over time, so that by the end of the Jindal administration, we had many, many Republicans who said the state were going in the negative direction. And today, we have many Democrats who say the state's going in the wrong direction. That tells me that there's a lot of different folks upset, probably for different kinds of reasons, and it's not all like politics of who's in power. Like, my guess is if we did more like political polling, we'd probably find out like Democrats think the state's going in the wrong direction, but they probably hate the legislature and not the governor, and Republicans opposite. Now, we don't do that kind of political stuff in this, so I can't speak to that. But it doesn't seem like it's being driven strictly by the party of the governor and the party of the respondent, but it used to. Thank you. Yes, right here.
On your website, can we get access to the data in do you have geographical subdivisions that you can look at the certain different regions?
Right, we do break responses out by region. We do generally, yes, so first of all, yes, the reports are there, and the reports contain breakouts by different demographic characteristics. We've recently transferred over, the Riley Center recently transferred over the website and is still in that process, so that each year also included all the crosstabs. All those files may not be up yet for every year, but we're in the process of getting them back up. Because the sample, it's large, but it's limited, so you can only do so many demographic breakdowns. We try to really ensure that we have good geographic representation. We actually don't do just a random sample of the state. We actually do 64 random samples within each parish, proportional to their share of the state's population. We want to make sure like Cameron and Grant aren't getting left out, St. Helena. But you don't end up with enough to say like, oh, this is what the folks in St. Helena think. And you certainly, every time I speak to folks in government, and I apologize if many of you are here, whenever I speak, I'll get like, hey, well, what about in my district? Like, I represent District 67. And it's like, I don't know what district they live in. I can just tell you what parish they live in. So we don't have that fine grain, but we can break it out by the big metro areas, and then, of course, splitting up north and south in the non-metro areas as well. Yes, ma'am.
How much of perception is driven by the media? I'm talking quality of life, crime issues. How much is driven by the media? What we see on TV and reading the paper every day?
Okay, so the question is how much are perceptions about quality of life driven by what we see on the media? The media has big effects, but it's not just the media as well. So for example, you mentioned crime. Crime's a great example. We saw this year for the first time in the history of the survey, crime was mentioned as the most frequently named, most important problem in the state. It's never been anywhere near as high as it was. It's usually economy or education named. Every now and then it's something else like disaster recovery after a hurricane, but usually it's economy or education. Crime jumps to the top. 80% of Louisianans say crime rates have gone up in the last few years. That's probably driven by both, because crime rates did actually go up over, or at least certain kinds did go up over the last several years, though some of them seem like they may be trending the other way now. But then it's also, we know, like media coverage matters too. So one of the reasons I think that it's a combination of both is particularly when we look at economic stuff. A lot of times we find respondents who say, I'm actually doing pretty good financially. I'm making more money than I made a year ago, but boy, this economy is terrible right now. That could be because of experiences of friends and neighbors, or it could be, what they hear in, say, national media coverage or things like that. Yes, sir?
Kind of dovetailing with that, my question is more of, we were looking at the dates of that negative perception, 2008, coming off of Katrina. Not necessarily traditional media, but how much of that, if you track social media use, skyrocketed at the same time that the perception of our life is going down?
Right, so it sounds like the question is, might social media use play into negative perceptions of quality of life? That seems to, I don't have the data to answer that. It seems like a totally reasonable hypothesis. The one pause to suggest to me that it's not the total driver is that we see these declines across a range of demographic characteristics that are only loosely correlated with social media use, right? So everybody's grandparents are on Facebook now, but they don't use social media as much as other folks. So even folks that are in the demographic groups that tend to use social media less, we also see these trends, which suggests to me that it may be coming from their own experiences, it may be coming from what they hear in traditional media, some of it may be coming from what they see in social media, but it's not any one of those alone. How are we doing on time?
One more.
One more, okay. Where?
Hi, thanks for speaking. Can you address the extent to which the opinions of Louisianans diverge from those of people across the U.S. and our region?
Okay, yeah, so the question is, how do Louisianans' opinions differ from across the nation, across the region? In some ways, it's pretty similar in the sense that like the polarization stuff, that's similar patterns. It's not quite as wide here as it is in other places, but you see similar trends. Perceptions about like the direction of the state there's differences between what people say in this state and what people across the nation say about the nation. To go back to an earlier question, when people are asked about like how things are going in the country, that is driven much, much more by partisan politics, the responses to that, than responses to the direction of the state. So there is still some separation here between like state and national. They're not just looking at the state through like a national politicized lens. Some of that's probably happening, but that's not all of it. So there's differences in that. What I don't have data on is how, and I don't know if this is what your question's speaking to, is what other folks around the country might think about Louisiana. That I don't know. I mean, there's all kinds of anecdotal evidence about like what folks think about the state of Louisiana and its residents. But whatever that may be, if those are negative, ours are increasingly negative views of ourselves as well. Thank you for this opportunity. I hope it's been helpful.